Christopher Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and I'm going to be talking with Danna MacKenzie, the Executive Director of the Office of Minnesota Broadband. I got that wrong.
Minnesota Office of Broadband Development.
Minnesota Office of Broadband Development. A position that I should say I was very nervous about and was very glad when you accepted. For people who aren't aware, Danna has worked for many years directly on IT and broadband up in Cook County, Minnesota, which is a little different from Cook County, Illinois.
Quite a bit different.
And so you brought a lot of different things, including, I think, a perspective of what it's like in these communities and having spent years trying to improve it. So very glad you're in the position.
Thank you.
We're here at the Blandon Border-to-Border Broadband Conference, and I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about what Minnesota's been doing well. You can tell me a little bit about how Blandon's programs have worked and how you may have interacted with them in your previous capacity, expanding broadband in rural Minnesota.
Well, the Blandon Foundation's one of their core pieces of work is developing leadership capacity in rural communities throughout Minnesota. And a number of years ago, they decided to capitalize on that experience and became aware of the criticality of broadband infrastructure and the skills to use it, and realized that it was a nice fit with the network of rural leadership that they had already built, and those same skills were applicable in developing the capacity around broadband in greater Minnesota. So ultimately they fund communities throughout the state to convene their local leaders and local stakeholders around the broadband issue and talk about where their needs are and where they'd like to go and how they'd like to capitalize on this infrastructure to better their community. And then the community is able to develop and name projects that are important to them. And the Blandon Foundation provides the monetary and convening support to help make those come to fruition. And they've been doing that across the state for years, and it's really making a difference.
Right, I think the matching grants is just incredibly powerful for a community that's thinking about whether it's a partnership or building their own network or just trying to figure out what their options are. The fact that Blandon can provide a match, I think, is very catalyzing in many communities.
And speaking from the state perspective, I very much appreciate the space that they're working in, because they are focused on supporting the pre-work that from the program that we run, which is the infrastructure development, the bigger financial components for actually installing the infrastructure. They really focus their funding on helping to pay for the feasibility study and getting a community ready to take advantage of that opportunity.
So let's talk about what the state's doing. Your office was created. That's one thing the state's doing. I think other states have created offices, haven't done nearly as much. You've had a budget to distribute funds. You know, we've had an argument, not me and you, but me and elected officials and many people in the state have had an argument about the appropriate size of the fund. I think it would be terrific to have put more money at your disposal to be distributing for expanding infrastructure. But you have had money to loan out or to give as grants. Let's talk a little bit about the RS Fiber, just to jump into that for a second. RS Fiber received some financial assistance from the state, and I'm curious if you can tell me about the process of RS Fiber, you know, in terms of the program. You know, they applied, what sort of things did they have to go through in order to access the funds?
I think the majority of their work actually came before they even came to us. As you mentioned, we've been working in this field for many years, and that group of communities has looked at numerous models to try and find something that they could successfully build and get service out into their sparsely populated area. And they finally arrived on this co-op model that would allow them to leap over some of those barriers that they had been facing when they were looking at different models. And so they had to do all of that pre-work and develop their financial relationships with a lot of different players before they came to us. We are just one investor in a very complex financial model that they have built, and we are glad to be there. I think one of the roles that we played was first in. It gave them the confidence to keep going and build those the other financial partnerships that they need to really make the thing successful.
the state of Minnesota has this fund that it's made available, and I've argued it should be more. Other people have argued it should be more. You had a limited budget, and you had a pretty significant impact. One of the projects that I love that you, your department chose to fund is RS Fiber, this new cooperative that was created after years of effort in farming country in Minnesota. And I'm curious because I think when you have such a limited pot of money, you're more likely to give it to established networks. And in fact, most of your grants went to established networks to help them to expand to nearby areas. And I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit about what RS Fiber did to make them compelling as in a competitive grant situation.
Well, you're right on that our responsibility with those dollars is to look at those applicants that have the most proven track record of being successful because we are managing risk of a state investment. I think that what allowed the RS Fiber application to shine in that ranking process was the team that they had assembled that put that proposal together, and that they have working on making sure that this new endeavor is going to be a success. And that's really what gave us the confidence to be one of their investors.
Great. It's been more than a year, I think, since the awards went out in the original batch, right? Do you have any results that you're particularly excited about?
We receive cards and letters and all quite regularly.
Digital e-cards?
Digital e-cards. We had a voicemail forwarded to us a couple of weeks ago from a very happy customer. I would just say that we are pleased that the awards were given in February of this year, and we already have customers online realizing what the improved service means in their lives. And so that's really probably the highlight of the work so far.
And what are some of the criteria that you established to make sure that this limited amount of money was going to have the most use and not go toward, networks that might need to be replaced soon or things like that?
Well, we're really bound by what's included in the legislation, so that's really, at the end of the day, that's what we have to default to. And there were some mechanisms built into that legislation to help guide the risks that you referred to. For instance, anything that state dollars were going to be invested in needed to be capable of delivering 100 meg symmetrical service, and so that really tends to put limitations on what pieces are being invested in, as well as there were requirements about the lack of service in the areas that qualified. And as you may know, there was legislative debate on whether or not the focus should be on the least served or the areas where there is no service versus the economic development potential. And so listening to the legislative intent over the last year, we actually rebalanced the scoring a little bit to reflect a balance of those interests, and so you'll likely see some of that come out in the next round of awards.
Great. I'm curious. We've been getting calls occasionally from other states with legislators that say, "Are you aware of other states that have done innovative programs and that sort of thing?" And I'm curious what you might say to a state that's just thinking about getting into this. What advice might you give based on your experience?
That is a great question. From Minnesota standpoint is a little bit unique. One of the first things, because we do get those calls regularly, is being aware of what the environment is in your state. In our case, we have a lot of small rural providers that we all consider good actors and partners in doing this work of getting the service out to where it currently isn't. So our first step, I believe, in successfully administering the program was engaging them and talking to them about what they need to be successful.
They were pretty skeptical at first, if I remember correctly.
Yes, they were very concerned about where this was going to go and how it was going to be used. And so we did our best to minimize the red tape while still holding awardees accountable for the goals that the state has set. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm curious, in a state, Minnesota and Iowa have, I think, the highest number of those independent telephone companies, so it is somewhat unique, mm-hmm. and I think it's wonderful to have locally based companies, and I would say not all of the independent companies are locally based. Some of them, at this point, are headquartered effectively out of places that have a lot more sun than Minnesota, but there's a lot of them that are still run out of Minnesota, and I have tremendous admiration for their efforts. But I am curious if there's any guidance you would give in terms of the language that would be used in terms of a technological requirement, because the RS Fiber project is terrific, but it starts with the wireless that is not itself scalable to 100 megabit for some of the customers. And I'm just curious if you would change any of the language, or if you think that that's pretty good to say the technology must be scalable to 100.
I'm going to have to say, I think for today, that language is serving us well, because there are folks who believe that shouldn't be in there at all, and there are folks who believe that we should have a much more aggressive standard. So it struck a nice balance that allows us to hold accountable to the pieces that the state is investing in are going to be a long-term investment and not a short-term investment. We do understand that those wireless technologies are good and reasonable bridge solutions while we get this long-term wired infrastructure in place.
Mm-hmm. I often think when it comes to policy, it would be great if I could just decide, it's hard to write a policy like that, because I think, sometimes it could be the same technology in a different entity. I think whether or not I would expect it would meet the needs of the community and be a good use of taxpayer dollars, but no legislation has yet said Chris will decide. So.
Nor Danna.
Right.
Thankfully, I lean on the legislation.
I guess just as we were wrapping up, I'd be curious if you can reflect on anything that was more challenging or more pleasing in terms of helping to roll out broadband across Minnesota. When you accepted the job, I'm curious how it's been different from what you might have expected and what other people might expect as we see more states developing not just an office like this, but an office like this that's empowered to do things.
The relationship building, it sounds so trite, but it's so incredibly important in getting this work done. As you mentioned earlier, the providers that do operate here in Minnesota were very hesitant. And so for this to happen in any meaningful way, because there certainly wasn't a way for brand new providers to just pop up and take the ball in the short time frame, we needed to engage those existing providers in an understanding that this was a tool that they could use effectively. And it's not just the providers, it's the other state agencies as we work to remove the barriers that are being discovered as we move along. It is the federal agencies. One of the things that folks don't know is that we work very closely with the federal agencies that are active, the FCC, the USDA, and the NTIA in the background. And in some cases, the USDA and Minnesota have the same customer, as it were, and so coordinating some of those efforts. So that's both a bit of a surprise and part of the fun of the job, is recognizing that we're all working together to meet those greater goals.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Danna MacKenzie, for coming to talk with us about Minnesota, what other states can learn from it. And thank you again to the Blandin Foundation for hosting us, having this great event. And I'll just wrap it up by saying I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Thank you.